Hi, everyone. Welcome to Riot's Lunch and Learn series. My name is Caroline Griffin. I'm Riot's Director of Operations, and I'm super excited to have Lauren Ross, CISA Manager at Cherry Bekaert CPAs and Advisors with us today to talk about SOC audits. What are they and why are they important? Just a couple of quick reminders before I hand it over to Lauren. This meeting is being recorded. It'll be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and then shared via the meetup group where you registered. And then if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do put those in the chat box and Lauren will answer as many of those as possible at the end. We'll make sure you have Lauren's contact information. It's up there, but we'll share it out as well so you can contact her directly after the lunch and learn with any additional questions. And the last reminder is the best way to view this presentation is in speaker view. That'll give you a nice big picture of Lauren's presentation and her on the right side. But without further ado, Lauren, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll hand it right on over.
All right, thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. It's nice to see a few familiar faces on today. So chances are if you're joining this, you either issue a SOC report, review a SOC report, are thinking about issuing a SOC report, or if none of the above, you're going to, regardless, get a good little kind of high-level overview of what are SOC audits, what are they used for, what are the different kinds. So we'll get right into it. So what are third-party service providers and what do we use them for? So when you're talking about a SOC audit, it's related to service providers or vendors. So things like payroll, claims, data center hosting, any task or function of a business that is being outsourced. A SaaS application, there's a ton of different examples here. So when you as a business are thinking about issuing a SOC report or reviewing a SOC report, why do you need to pay attention to third-party vendors? So outsourcing services or tasks to third parties doesn't absolve the service organization of the responsibility. So thinking about, for example, if you, use Amazon for, web hosting, just because you've outsourced it to Amazon, you're still concerned about, their environment, making sure that your data is safe and secure, right? And, data breaches caused by third parties are on the rise. So let's say, you're using a payroll provider, they get hacked, they get access to your employees' information, and then somehow they're able to then launch a phishing campaign, and then they've, gotten access to your environment, right? So keeping a close eye on third parties, the vendors that you use, is really important because it can, end up directly impacting you and your system. And oftentimes there's kind of a lack of visibility into these third-party relationships. So, a lot of times once you start using them, you're not really super aware of their day-to-day operations and what's going on with, them and their environment. You're just mostly concerned about knowing what's going on with, your specific data and how you're using their system, but you may not have visibility to their entire environment, right? So there's a few different ways that, you can think about how to govern these vendors, right? So direct monitoring, like keeping, close tabs by checking in with them regularly, right to audit, having an outside firm come in and audit based on a set of criteria you've defined yourself. These are both a little bit labor intensive. And I'm sure, service level agreements, many of the vendors that you use, you probably have an SLA defined for certain key areas. But then how do you know that these are being carried out consistently, right? So that's kind of where SOC reports come in, is, there's a combination of these approaches used, but a SOC report is going to make sure that these service level agreements are being actually upheld by the use of an audit. So the difference with a SOC report audit versus direct auditing is one report being given to all customers versus, every single customer going in and auditing that vendor, right? So to that end, what are SOC reports? So SOC, accountants love acronyms. SOC stands for System and Organization Controls. And it's really a suite of reports, but the regular SOC 1, SOC 2 reports are the most commonly known. So the SOC for service organizations, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, you might have heard of. There is also a SOC for cybersecurity, which isn't quite as popular yet. It's more so just starting to get some traction as a report that people are really using. And SOC for supply chain is kind of in the pipeline. That's coming downstream soon. But regardless, all of these are single audits that can be pushed to key stakeholders. So like I was saying, how, every single customer wanting to go in and audit a vendor versus that vendor issuing a single audit report, which they can then give to all their customers. So they report on the services provided by the service organization, giving information that users need to assess and address the risks associated with that outsourced service. So it's just kind of one big consolidated report that ideally all customers of a vendor's system or application or service would be able to use. So just a high level, if anyone is interested how this has evolved over the years, it started off as there were these SysTrust and WebTrust reports. And then that was just kind of it for, there was no SOC 1, there was no SOC 2, it was just SysTrust and WebTrust. Then SaaS 70 was put into place as for ICFR reporting, which then led to SOC 1, and SSAE 16 is a AICPA auditing standards board standard that went out. SOC 1 has since been replaced by SSAE 16 has since been replaced by SSAE 18. And that's basically just the auditing standard in place, the framework for how a SOC 1 report is conducted. A SOC 2, however, is governed under AICPA AT 101, which is Trust Service Principles and Criteria. So again, it's just the standards behind how any SOC 2 or 3 report is conducted. It's across the board, any SOC 2 or 3 report is governed by AT 101. Any SOC 1 report is governed by SSAE 18. And so narrowing into that a little bit more, the difference between a SOC 1, 2, or 3. So a SOC 1, the reason that there's different standards governing each of these is a SOC 1 reports on system and controls at a service organization that may be relevant to user entities' internal control over financial reporting. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a couple slides, but when we're talking about internal control over financial reporting, a SOC 1 is going to be a little bit more geared towards what we call business processes. So, bank reconciliations, more key financial processes. A SOC 2 also reports on controls at a service organization, but it's relevant to the trust services criteria defined by the AICPA. And this is a specific framework, just like NIST has a framework, ISO has a framework. The trust services criteria defined by the AICPA, which is specifically DC 200, it's a framework that has to be followed. Every single SOC 2 report, which we'll explain in a little bit more detail, every single SOC 2 report has the same control objectives, the same points of focus that are evaluated. It's just the individual micro layer control activities of how they accomplish that vary from organization to organization. And a SOC 3 is basically just a condensed SOC 2. So a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 are what we call restricted use reports. They are intended only for the user entities of the vendor that's issuing the SOC report. So you would only give this to customers that are asking for it. This isn't something you would just hand out to anyone and everyone. It's specific to users of your system. A SOC 3, however, is general use, and that can just be put out to the world. So if you were to go look up AWS's SOC 3, you can find that because it's a general use report. And it's just a little bit more condensed. It doesn't have all the detail of a SOC 2. It's really just a marketing tool more than anything to show that we have something. So when you're thinking about which SOC report is right for you, whether it's you thinking about issuing a SOC report or for you're using a vendor and you're trying to figure out, should I be asking them if they issue a SOC 1 or should I be asking them if they issue a SOC 2? You're going to want to think about what is the purpose behind it? So for a SOC 1, is the report going to be used as part of, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance for publicly traded companies? Is the external auditor saying, okay, this is a key function and we need to see their SOC report? Or is this going to be part of an audit that you are planning to do, maybe not Sarbanes-Oxley, but some sort of other audit or integrated audit of your customers' financial statements? That's a SOC 1. If it's more so to gain confidence and place trust in your system, or for you to get comfort with a vendor system, that's going to be a SOC 2, and it's more security. There's a few criteria, but it's at its core a security-based report. And so, do your customers have the need for an ability to understand the details of the processing and controls? That's a SOC 2. There's also, to make things even more complicated, there's a SOC 2 plus. So like I mentioned, SOC 2 is a framework. There's also frameworks like, ISO, NIST, HIPAA, sorry for the typo on HIPAA there. But do you want to also think about another framework? You could do a SOC 2 plus where maybe you take, the ISO framework and you look at all your SOC 2 controls, and then you use those same controls to map to ISO's framework. You could include that in this as well, and then it's a SOC 2 plus. So why SOC? Again, we've kind of touched on these, but just to reiterate here, a SOC 1 is required if you're providing services to a publicly traded company, like for Sarbanes-Oxley purposes, or if it's part of a contract or RFP perhaps. A SOC 2 is going to be required by customers. So a SOC 1 is, typically as a part of a Sarbanes-Oxley financial statement audit. If your auditor needs this SOC report, it's going to be required. However, a SOC 2 is more likely going to be driven by customers you already have, or if you have an RFP out and they're saying, well, we need to see your SOC report before we agree to go with you, or this other company we're considering has a SOC report and you guys don't. That's more so it's for competitive edge and for your existing customers' needs. And then SOC 2 plus, again, it's just sort of combining compliance efforts. If you want to show, well, we're ISO compliant, we're NIST compliant, we're HIPAA compliant. It's just kind of a way to combine those efforts into one audit. And again, SOC 3 is more so just to look cool more than anything. It's not really giving a ton of assurance. It's pretty condensed. You'd want to see their SOC 2 report to really get comfortable, but it's more so just kind of a way to put something out there to the world so that it's publicly accessible. So to get even more complicated, because there's SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3, within a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, there is also a type 1 or a type 2. So all SOC reports, type 1, type 2, SOC 1, SOC 2, all of them include an auditor's opinion on the accuracy of the system description presented by management, which we'll get into a little bit more detail on what the system description is. And they will all include an assessment of the design of controls and confirmation that controls have been implemented. So, are there policies in place? Do you have written processes? That's design. It's not really looking at the actual configurations or actual examples, but, is it designed in a way that, is correctly and well done. However, a type 2 report takes the type 1 report, which includes those first two things, a step further, and it's going to opine on operating effectiveness of controls over a period of time. So to put that into an example, if you think about change management, in a type 1 report, you might just be looking to say, okay, do you have a change management process where, developers check out code, it's reviewed and approved, and there's testing done, and then a high-level management approval before a change is deployed into production. And you kind of see that there's a design in place, you understand how the process works. That's at a type 1 level. And you might go through one example. A type 2, however, we're going to look at the period of time covered by the report. So let's say it's a year. We're going to look at what is the population of all change deployments you've had during the period. And then we're going to select a sample of changes throughout the period and put it to the test to see, was testing done? Were there proper approvals? and just kind of go down to that level to actually make sure that it was operating and not just designed. So that's the difference between a type 1 and a type 2. The type 2 is just giving a higher level of assurance that the controls that a service organization is saying they're doing are actually being accomplished. So within a SOC 2, I mentioned that that's more security focused, it's IT focused. Every single SOC 2 is going to include the security criteria. So these 5 things are all possible components of a SOC 2 report, but the only one that is required, and you will see in every single SOC 2 report you ever review, is security. And so the security principle is that information and systems are protected against unauthorized access, unauthorized disclosure of information, and damage to systems. So security is kind of the high level comprehensive criteria that's going to look at, recoverability of data, change management, logical access controls, physical access controls, governance and entity level controls, monitoring, just kind of the high level, every major component of security. These other ones are going to be a lot more customer driven, depending on what your service you're providing is. So availability is going to be really relevant for a data center hosting service organization, right? Making sure that information and systems are available for operation and use. Confidentiality, that might be relevant to someone who's handling PII as part of their service. Processing integrity, for something like claims or payroll that you need to make sure is timely and complete. There's a lot of information flowing back and forth. You might include the processing integrity principle. And same thing for privacy, for personal information, taking it a step further from confidentiality. So thinking about a SOC report, whether it's a SOC 1 or a SOC 2, there's some key sections that are included. So there's management's assertion, and we'll break these down a little bit more in the coming slides, but management's assertion, the auditor's opinion, the system description, the test of controls and conclusions, and then any other information that a service organization wants to include. So management's assertion is basically a time for the owner of the service organization to claim that everything that's been presented throughout the report and the system description is accurate. They have provided the auditor with accurate and complete information, that it was prepared in accordance with the AICPA standards, and that controls have been designed and implemented to achieve the objectives defined. So it's basically, we'll issue our auditor's opinion, but then the management's assertion is them saying that everything that they've provided to us is complete and accurate, and that they stand by that everything has been designed and implemented properly. And if it's a type 2, that they've operated effectively. The auditor's opinion is kind of broken down into a few major parts. So a big part of it is the scope of the report. So when we are evaluating a service organization, there's clear boundaries on what specifically it is we're auditing. So what we are concerned about with is the specified criteria, which is the framework or the governance standards imposed by SOC 1 or SOC 2. So DC 200 for a SOC 2, or management's assertion for a SOC 1. And then we are not disclaiming or not claiming any sort of opinion related to complementary user control considerations or subservice organization controls, or if there's any additional information provided. We are strictly focused on the controls that management has implemented and how they're designed and operated effectively. I'll get into it towards the end a little bit more detail on what complementary user control considerations are and complementary subservice organization controls, but essentially a complementary user control considerations are the things that a vendor is saying, we are doing all this stuff on our end, but you as the reader of the report, there's certain things you need to do too for everything to really function the way it's, for it to function in an ideal world, you have to do certain things too. We can't give you 100% comfort because there's things on your end you need to make sure are also happening as well. And subservice organization controls is just like what it sounds like. If the service organization is using another service organization. So, if you are issuing a report, you're a SaaS application, you might use someone like maybe AWS for hosting your data. So that AWS to the SaaS application is a subservice organization. And so they're saying, we have all these controls in place, but we can't give, there's certain things that you have to rely on AWS for because it's out of our hands to a certain extent because you have to rely on their SOC report for these specific areas. We don't claim an opinion on that. And then anything other information presented, that's just really a place where if there was an exception found in the report and management wants to give more detail as to why something might have happened and why there's really no risk associated with it, or, God forbid, a data breach happened, but they want to give information to their customers to explain how they were able to recover data and, or if it's just something additional they want to share about, leadership changes or, something big that's happened at the company, they can include that in Section 5, and we don't claim an opinion on that either. So the service organization's responsibilities and the management's assertion is presented in all SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports. And we're really reiterating that management is responsible for fairness and accuracy of the system description, which, as I guess to give a little bit more detail there, there's management's assertion, there's our opinion, there's the test of controls. The system description is the real deep dive on what the report is covering. So this is our service, or this is the system. These are basically in narrative form, all the controls, and a little bit deeper dive on the intricacies of how a system is designed. So part of the opinion is reiterating that management is responsible for the fairness and accuracy of that description of the system because it's their system. They have to take ownership of that. Providing the services or products covered by the system description. We as the auditor are not responsible for, we do vetting to make sure that what we understand is fair and accurate. But, if management is blatantly lying and hiding something that we wouldn't be able to detect, that's where this kind of comes into play, showing that they are responsible for fairness and accuracy of the description, and also for actually providing the service or the product covered by the description. We're not the one providing that service or function. And management is also responsible for specifying what control objectives they want to include if it's a SOC 1, or selecting which trust services criteria. So if they want to just do security, or they want to include availability or processing integrity, et cetera, that's all management's decision and their choice. And then also management is responsible for properly designing, implementing, and making sure that the controls are operating effectively. So we as the auditor can provide a certain degree of counsel in terms of, if they say, oh, if we do this, is this, if we do this, would this be the proper design for meeting this criteria? We can give them feedback there, but we cannot actually go into their system and configure something or actually make a change or anything like that. We have to maintain a degree of independence. So management is responsible for designing, implementing, and actually operating. Our responsibilities as the auditor is to express an opinion on the fairness and accuracy of the system description. So, like I said, management has to give us valid information, and it's their responsibility to make sure that it's fair and accurate. But we are going to say, in our best judgment, do we agree with that or not? And we'll also note if we agree with them that the design and implementation is appropriate. So they are the ones who have to actually do the designing, do the implementing, but then we'll make an opinion on if we think it has been properly designed or implemented. And then operating effectiveness over a period of time if it's a type 2 report. So this is all based on the standards we have conducted our engagement under. So The AICPA attestation standards are different for a SOC 1 versus a SOC 2, like we talked about. So a SOC 1 is SSAE 18, a SOC 2 is AT 101, I believe off the top of my head, but that's DC 200 for a system description. And we also identify the procedures performed throughout our engagement. So we basically just claim that we have obtained an understanding of the system and assessed the presentation. We've assessed the design and operating effectiveness of the controls. These are what we've done to get comfort over the things that we're expressing an opinion on. These are the things that we've done to how we got to that point. So high level, the main meat of the opinion that you as a reader of a report are going to be concerned with is a section that's about 3/4 down in the opinion that's going to say whether we agree or not that the system description accurately presents the system, that the controls were suitably designed and implemented, and if it's a type 2, that the controls were operating effectively throughout the reporting period. So those are the main 3 things that when you're reviewing a SOC report, or if you're the one issuing it, that you want to make sure those things are good, is that the auditor agrees that the system description is accurate and fair in presenting the system, controls are suitably designed and implemented, and they're operating effectively. So where we actually talk about what we did to make our way to that opinion is found in section 4 of our report. So the actual format of a report is going to vary from company to company that's issuing it. For example, these are snips from 2 different reports that we issue just based on customer formatting preferences. But for a SOC 1, which you'll see a SOC 2 down here, it has security common criteria. This is the same in every single SOC 2 report. This is the security common criteria, and then there's going to be a CC 1.0, CC 2.0, that's the same. In a SOC 1, based on the needs of your customers and the type of system, you are actually designing the control objectives yourself. So that's going to vary from customer to customer, report to report. But every single section 4 is going to include the control activities defined by management. So here, changes are documented and tracked in a change management system. Down here, these controls are specific to some HR related ones. So background check, confidentiality agreement signed for all employees. There's policies in place over workforce conduct standards. So it's going to have all throughout the report. This is going to be, 30, 40 pages, depending on how many controls are in it. All of the controls management has defined. And then the tests of controls, what we did as the auditor to get comfort over how they were designed and operated. So there's usually, you're going to see that there's inquiry performed, some type of questions asked. And then you'll often see the terms of obtain and inspected evidence, observed evidence, reperformed a calculation or something. Inspection is the biggest one for actually reviewing documentation, having, access to and seeing information, or same thing with observing. A lot of times we'll actually, if we go on site to a company and they are doing their own data, they have their own data center on site, we're actually physically observing that, okay, the firewalls are in a locked box, or there's, you have to have a key card to enter into it, or something like that. So all of that stuff is going to be outlined. And then the results of our testing, which is if there's no issue that we found, no exceptions noted. If, let's say, it was a control where, so like down here, a background check is performed on all candidates as part of the hiring process. For a type 2 report, we would look, okay, here's all new hires during the period. We're going to select a sample throughout, and then we're going to see, okay, show me their background check. Let's say for maybe 1 out of 5 new hires during the period, they can't provide that background check to us. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe they can't find it because they didn't retain it properly. Maybe there was some sort of weird issue why it didn't happen. That would be noted here in the results saying, for 1 of 5 new hires, exception noted. So you see this term up here, qualify. So an exception in itself is not necessarily a huge issue in terms of how the auditor's opinion is presented. You can still have a clean opinion with a few, exceptions perhaps noted. Where that term of qualify comes into play, that means if the auditor's opinion is changed and we do not believe that for a control objective entirely, we can't say that the control objective was met. So a control objective is comprised of all, these different kinds of control activities. So this is only 3. There's probably a few more for CC 1.1, which is part of CC 1.0, which has CC 1.1 through 1.5, I believe. And so let's say there was this one exception here. That's probably not going to be a qualification. But let's say there was like 3 exceptions here, 3 people that they couldn't show us evidence of background checks being performed. And then maybe we selected a sample of employees for confidentiality agreements, and there's a bunch of exceptions there too. And then maybe they don't actually have these policies in place, or they haven't been, reviewed or looked at in 10 years. Then you start to see a trend and you're thinking, I don't know if this whole criteria of CC 1.0 is being accomplished. That's where you start talking about potentially qualifying on a report. It's a accumulation of issues that if they're so significant that the whole entire control objective, we can't say with confidence is, designed and operated effectively. So going back to, I know I said I'd get back to this, user control considerations. So these are the controls which are necessary to the achievement of control objectives or criteria, just like the control activities defined by management, that they are the user entity's responsibility and the service organization cannot control them. So what is an example of that? These are things like if a client user has administrative access. So let's say you're using some sort of financial SaaS system, and you within that system, they give you the ability as part of their interface, you can assign users different permission levels and things, right? You're the one who knows your employees, the company, who has to have access to what and to what degree. Or let's say the system is customizable to where you can set your own password requirements. They're saying, okay, we are taking, ownership of all of these control activities, but because we give you this functionality, you have to be the one to actually implement it yourselves. Those are user control considerations. And so they're saying that you need to be doing things on your end as the customer to make sure that the control objectives they've defined really are, operating at full capacity. And these are going to be presented in the system description, so you know exactly what it is that they're telling you you are responsible for. And then kind of on the other hand, complementary subservice organization controls they are something the service organization cannot control. And they, again, are saying that we've defined these control objectives or criteria, and we think that these are important enough that they need to be done in order for this control objective or criteria to really be met. But these are for subservice organizations instead of clients. So it's like the example I mentioned of maybe the vendor that's issuing the SOC report, they outsource a function, just like, you have obviously outsourced something to be reviewing this report, they outsource something as well. So they're going to tell you up front, these are the things that we do outsource. So you know exactly what's being outsourced and what that company is responsible for. So then you can review their SOC report if you feel so inclined, or you at least have awareness of what they're saying we do not have responsibility over, and this is provided by someone else. So pretty common examples are logical or physical access if the application is hosted elsewhere, whether it's at a physical data site or in the cloud. Oftentimes companies might use another service organization for monitoring. Maybe they outsource their SIM provider, or backups and file restorability, things like that. So that is really it. I know that was a lot of information. It's a lot of acronyms, a lot of type 1s and type 2s, but if you do have any questions, we've got plenty of time, and I'd like to get to as many of those as I can. So Caroline, did we have any questions that came in?
Thank you so much, Lauren. I don't see any in the chat box at this time. If you feel more comfortable unmuting yourself and asking questions, please do. Or if you feel more comfortable putting those in the chat box, I'm happy to ask those to Lauren. We had one just come in. Lauren, what's the timeline of these policy development?
So I guess I'll take it a step further. When you're issuing a SOC report, it typically it covers a period of time, typically a year, but it can be shorter or it could be longer. So if, let's say, it's covering a period of time, 1/1 to 12/31, we are going to do the bulk of our auditing in that last month, and then going into the month after. There's certain controls that we want to see were in place before the period end, and then we'll kind of do our documentation after that. Typically, most reports are issued within about 45 to 60 days of the period end. So if you were a 12/31 year end, that report would probably be issued late February, early to mid-March. As far as if you're talking about actually getting to a place where you can issue a SOC report, that is something that is more of a consulting and readiness practice, which can really vary. I mean, depending on how quickly you need to get a report issued based on your customer requirements. So I've had some clients that we've been working on readiness with them for over a year. I've had some clients that it was, a 3 or 4 month process, and then we immediately went into a type 1, then they issued a type 2 6 months later. So we will work as fast as, you're able to. Hope that answered that.
Thanks, Lauren. There was a follow-up question here. If the controls are found lacking, are the customers allowed to apply again immediately, or is there a wait time?
So so if, let's say, there was a qualified opinion issued or there were exceptions noted, I mean, you as the issuer of the report, you are not bound to any specific time period. That's why you see some SOC reports with the 12/31 year end, some with the 6/30 year end. You're not bound to any specific year end. However, your customers most likely need the report for a specific reason, whether it's, for a SOC 1 because of, if for a SOC 1, it's because of their Sarbanes-Oxley audit that's going on. So they always want those reports before February. So if you were to issue a report in, June, that's not going to give them as much comfort at the time that they need. All that to say, if there's not any contractual timelines that you're bound to, I mean, you could have another SOC audit performed in a 6-month period rather than waiting that full 12 months again. The timeline's really up to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. Leave it open for a couple more minutes with any other questions. While we're waiting, just a couple quick reminders. This was recorded, so Lauren did provide some amazing information, but you will be able to go back and reference that video. Another follow-up here. At the beginning, you mentioned how SOC policies came about. I'm curious when these were first put in place.
Oh gosh, I might have to get back to you on that. I don't know that I know specific dates. I think that, SSAE 18 for SOC 1 has just been within the last couple of years. The trust services criteria for SOC 2 just had a revamp a couple of years ago as well. I think that SysTrust and Web Trust, where this all kind of started, was in either maybe the 90s. And then it's kind of just evolved every few years since then. If you'd like pointed dates, I can certainly provide those to you after the call. Just shoot me an email and I can get those to you.
Perfect. Great questions. And thanks, Lauren, for the really great answers. Let's see. Leo, go ahead. I see you raise your hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I can't type. I'm not very familiar with the topic, but I do work in the financial services space and do understand controls. How do you address an organization where you walk in, you're talking about SOC 2, which are IT controls, but that organization is implementing the COBIT framework, and you also mentioned the NIST framework. So how how do you rationalize between, I guess, the different frameworks in terms of what's needed for a specific financial or regulatory report?
Yeah, so talking about a SOC 2 first, because that's a little bit easier to explain. The framework that I mentioned, the trust services criteria framework, that's defined and set the same way that, a COBIT framework or any other one is. And so by looking at the objectives that are defined, there's also what are called points of focus, which are kind of the prompting questions and things you should be thinking about for each control activity. So there's a lot of similarities between all these different IT frameworks. A lot of them have some sort of subsection related to change management, something related to logical access, related to governance or entity level controls. And so you oftentimes don't need to start from scratch with creating control activities. It's if you've already gone through one assessment and have done one mapping or whatever, you can just sort of think about then applying it to the SOC 2 framework where there's similarities. For a SOC 1, that is completely vendors, customer or vendor or service organization specific as to what those control objectives and activities are, depending on what it is that your customers need. So let's say that you've done some sort of mapping exercise already. You can use those control activities again, but the way you define the control activities in a SOC 1 is based on what it is that your customers need. So let's say let's say I have a property management company client, and one thing that they want to make sure that their customers know about is that they're performing bank reconciliations every month and that cash receipts and disbursement processes are properly defined. So those are a couple of objectives they've defined and then assigned the control activities. And maybe they've gone through some sort of internal controls mapping assessment before. Then they're not starting from scratch. They can say, oh, well, we've already defined all of these activities and processes here, so we'll pull them into our SOC 1 report under these objectives. I know it's kind of confusing. I hope that made sense, but basically, you never have to start from scratch. If you have done a mapping to another framework or something, you can then bring in those controls to whatever other framework. And that's why there's a SOC 2 plus. So if you go through a SOC 2 and you have this mapping done, but then you want to say, well, we've actually already mapped all of these controls to the NIST framework as well, you can then present that mapping so that it's in the report too.
Thank you. That helps. I have another, maybe not a follow-up. When you work with these organizations and you look at controls, now you just mentioned, there's a control that could be aligned or applicable to financial reporting. Maybe a different set of controls that apply to IT and a different set of controls that apply to information security, and maybe another set that applies to operational risk. What are you seeing? Are you seeing like 4 different controls? Because each department in the company, has a certain specialization in risk management, like a IT firm, not an IT firm, but there's a department that specializes in information technology. So they look at the information technology controls. Somebody specializes in InfoSec, someone in financial reporting. Or do you see a case where there's, one control that sort of traverses all of these domains? And then also when you mentioned testing, how is testing done? In the sense, is it one person that has domain expertise, not that they need it, but at some point in time, somebody needs some domain expertise across, financial reporting, maybe data, technology, InfoSec, ops risk. What are you seeing maybe in the outside world, and what would you recommend as best practices?
Sure. Well, so the way it really just depends on the size of the service organization, to be honest. When we first engage in a SOC audit, there is a big period of really just information gathering. And we really call that, kind of walkthroughs. But typically there's one point in contact whose, their job is making sure the SOC report gets issued. And then, we go through with them to say, okay, these are the domains that are part of a SOC 2 report. So, change management, logical access, physical access, whatever, all of those. We are going to talk to that person and say, okay, these are the different things that we need to learn more about. Who is going to be the best person to lead us in these discussions? And then it's kind of on the customer or the service organization, to then tell us, okay, you need to meet with this person for this and this person for this. So it's really just a lot of information gathering and wrapping our head around who the right people are in the beginning. So the first year that can be kind of a significant undertaking. It's not going to be as difficult for smaller organizations, understandably, who don't have as much, delineation between different functions. But that's, something that takes some time in the beginning just to make sure we have the right people, the right, what we call control owners to talk through the different areas with. From our side, as far as the testing, I think what you're asking is how do we, as the auditor, have the appropriate skill set for certain areas, I think is what you're saying. So yes, correct. We do have certain people who are, more technical, maybe they're, an AWS expert, and then we've got someone who's an Azure expert, or maybe someone who does a lot in pretty much all cloud environments. And then maybe, for a certain type of environment, this person does mostly SOC reports on, private banking institutions. That person's going to get, if a new job comes in related to a banking institution, that's going to go, into their service book. So we definitely match, up who's performing audits according to strengths of our team. There's a good bit of, hybrid kind of cross training. So everyone has a certain degree, everyone is certainly qualified to work on these reports. But then if there's certain things that are a little bit more technical and maybe require some nuance, we would pull in the appropriate resource to help us make sure everything is, being properly understood for that kind of niche area where applicable. Does that make sense?
It does, and appreciate the information. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks, Leo. A couple questions have come in on the chat. The first one is, have you noticed any common themes relating to exceptions or report qualifications? Seems like lately we've been reviewing more reports with IT-related issues, particularly logical access. Just trying to gauge if there may be more focus around these areas by service auditors.
So I will tell you that in a SOC 2 report, logical access and change management are the highest risk areas. And that's where you're going to see auditors digging the most deep, and where exceptions are more likely to occur. I don't think that it's specific to any, one firm. It's just where the most risks lie, right? Who has access to certain things, which, if access were in the wrong hands, someone could do something malicious, fraud could occur. That's just part of the risks, underlying risks with logical access. Change management as well is pretty high risk because you don't want someone to go rogue and, send out a bug or crash a system, or maybe even it's not malicious, but there wasn't a proper review done of code, and then it gets deployed out and then the whole system crashes, and then that's, affecting you financially, right? So those are two areas that you're going to see exceptions in more often than not, just because they are a higher risk area. Anything where there's sample testing done is going to be a higher risk, because as you're selecting a sample of people, it's just more likely that you're going to potentially have an issue. So things like HR controls for new hires terms, it's not super uncommon for sample tests there. Or the same thing with change management. When we select a sample of changes and we're getting down into the nitty gritty of every single change, it's just a higher likelihood of exceptions. So I don't know that there's necessarily a trend I've seen across reports for, one specific domain area, other than it's just pretty consistent in logical access and change management.
Thanks, Lauren. Another question here. What about SOC for cybersecurity and SOC for supply chain? Is it part of every SOC audit, or can they be optional?
So those are completely independent. They're a type of report in themselves. So there's a SOC 1 report, there's SOC 2 reports, SOC 3 reports, SOC for cybersecurity, SOC for supply chain, which is still coming. So those are just a completely different independent report that has their own framework and underlying guidance, the way that SSA 18 governs SOC 1 and AT 105 or 1, whatever governs SOC 2. There's a whole separate governing framework for SOC for cybersecurity, and there will be for SOC for supply chain.
Thanks, Lauren. A lot of great questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, another question just came in. Have there been cases for false negatives where companies were cleared but later had data breaches or other issues?
So where you're saying that we issued a report, did not find any exceptions, but then a breach occurred afterwards or something. It's what we hope never happens. It's something, you have to understand with a SOC report is that it is not an absolute guarantee that, we're basing it on reasonable assurance, right? That based on what we've reviewed, what the information that's been presented, how we've audited, we have reasonable assurance that the controls are designed and operating effectively. We're not issuing an opinion to say, oh, there's 100% certainty that this system, would detect a breach and prevent it from happening. That's why it's kind of a little bit higher level than that. So all that to say, that's kind of the worst case scenario. What a SOC report, specifically SOC 2, is really trying to do is make sure that the main security elements that would need to be in place in order to prevent something like a breach from happening have been addressed and have been designed and are operating effectively to the best of the ability. But if something were to happen afterwards, that's just something that the service organization is responsible for sharing with their stakeholders as it affects them, and is not something that we personally would go back and then change our opinion on after the fact. There is one thing I caveat to that: when we're performing an audit, there's a time period we're looking at, right? Like I said, of maybe 1/1 to 12/31. We do perform a set of inquiries with management in the time between it takes for our report to be issued and the period end. So like I said, a lot of reports, if a 12/31 is the year end, they're probably issued in maybe like mid-February. Before we issue a report, we have an obligation to reach out to management and say, has anything happened between 12/31 and then today's date? Has anything happened that would affect the design or operation of control activities? Basically, have you been breached? Did you find out that, something really significant that impacted your control environment in some area? Has anything happened at all that your customers have an obligation to know about? And typically, 9 times out of 10, they tell us no, everything's still good. But we are required to ask that. And then if anything had happened, we are required to disclose that in the report. And then there's kind of a process that has to be followed with how that all gets, disclosed. But we do ask the question.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Follow-up question. Are there other certifications of trust equivalent / competitors to SOC?
Not really that I'm aware of. I mean, there's certainly other audits out there, like you've probably heard of High Trust, which is going to be specific to, the healthcare industry, which they, a company might choose to undergo a high trust audit instead of a SOC audit, because they're saying, a high trust audit is going to encompass everything a SOC 2 would address anyways. But there's not necessarily really a competitor. It's just kind of the standard that exists.
Thanks, Lauren.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Those are all the questions I'm seeing in the chat box. So again, thank you so much, Lauren. Great presentation. I encourage anyone who thinks of additional questions to please reach out to Lauren directly. Her email address is provided right there, lross@cbh.com.
Yep.
And Cherry Bekaert does a great job of hosting these about once a quarter with a variety of different topics. You can find past sessions on Riot's YouTube channel, and they'll have some other great topics coming up in the remainder of 2022. So be on the lookout for those. But thank you all for attending. And thanks again, Lauren, for a great presentation and answering all those fantastic questions.
Yeah, thank you again. And I mean, I know it's a lot of information. If you go back or look at the presentation later and have any more, I'm happy to answer any of those. So don't be afraid to reach out. But thank you guys for joining. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
Lauren.
you.
Take care,
Appreciate it.
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.